On Wednesday, the 18th of June, the US Supreme Court ruled that the state of Tennessee was well within its rights to ban the medical transing of children back in 2023. This is a landmark ruling, but how much of a difference will it make? And did the justices really grapple with all the key issues? I caught up with attorney Glenna Goldis, who has been following this case closely and has provided really solid analysis on her X and Substack. She was also part of a rally outside the Supreme Court during the hearing to highlight the harms of gender-affirming care, particularly to young gays and lesbians. Before we get into it, please subscribe if you haven't already, like this video, and leave a comment. If you don't know what to say, just say, "Stop transing kids!" And please do consider supporting my channel. You can do so monthly via Patreon, or send me a one-off tip via PayPal, or on here via Super Thanks. Okay, let's go meet Glenna. Glenna, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we've just had a very big ruling come in.
Yes, we have. This was the big one for the United States. We've been waiting for this for years, basically.
Would you say this is one of the biggest rulings maybe ever in the States around the topic of sex and gender?
Yeah, some people, you might say Bostock, but I think this one is more consequential, and that one was kind of a rehearsal. It had some, I think the justices themselves know there are some issues with Bostock, and now they're starting to get more in control of the content.
And you were actually there outside the Supreme Court when the hearing was happening, right?
Yes, that morning, it was December 4th of last year, and in DC at the Supreme Court, the Supreme Courthouse. And I was at a rally that was held outside of it. It was a very diverse rally. There were a lot of gay people like me who oppose pediatric gender medicine because we think it's, hurting these gender nonconforming kids. And there were a lot of conservatives also. So that this lawsuit involves the state of Tennessee. And this was pushed by their, politicians in that state, as this happened across the country. And so it was this great diverse mix of, gay people. There were liberals under the banner of, for example, Democrats for an Informed Approach for Gender. There were parents who were standing up for science and, had signs about the CAST review. And so we were all there on the plaza outside the Supreme Court building. There were speeches. And then, unfortunately, on the other side of the plaza were the people in support of gender medicine, including many celebrities, and they made it their mission to drown us out. So they didn't succeed. Our side was still giving these fantastic speeches and, getting to talk to the reporters who were there and meet with each other. But we also had just this constant noise and screaming from the other side of the plaza, the celebrities and the people, who just didn't want our message to get out.
Had you ever been to something like that before, like that type of rally, and having a group just wanting to shut you out or shut you down, rather?
I don't think so. I've been to some rallies before, supported various causes, usually sort of lefty things. But no, I don't recall another one where there were counter-protesters who really wanted to drown us out. Usually, the other side just lets you go. They don't organize against you. That's a lot of work.
Right. Yeah, it's like I've never come across that before myself. And so I've, been going to these different events for like 5 years. Every time they show up, just to try, as you say, try and drown you out. What's interesting is they could not do that inside the Supreme Court. And that's where all these arguments played out, which we'll get into in a bit. What is your own background in law?
So I'm a lawyer here in New York. I practice in the area of consumer protection. And so that kind of is what has inspired me in working on these gender issues. I just see this as a kind of a giant fraud, honestly. Like, these gender doctors are, they're businesses, and they are selling lies to consumers who are the patients, telling them that they somehow are the opposite sex, or implying that they can change sex, not revealing the side effects. It's all the things I see in my regular job as an attorney. I see them also popping up in this gender world. So I've been consumer protection. I've worked in government. I also have a past working in legal aid. So that's like representing poor people in problems involving, for example, domestic violence or housing.
Right. Oh, that's interesting that you come from the sort of the consumer angle. I'm just trying to look something. Andrea James, right? Just as we're talking, there's a man called, he goes by the name Andrea James.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
I've got a page on his website.
So do I.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And he once wrote about having had lots of surgery on his skull. right, to make himself look more like a lady. But he was very clear about calling it a consumer guide. It takes it away from medical into a capitalist thing, and this is what I want, therefore I should have it. I'm paying the money, give it to me. Which I think in this area is so. But even then, even if you were to see it as a purely consumerist thing, you still have that issue of the false promises being made.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny how they do that. They kind of hide it in public. In public, they want to paint it as medical, especially when it has to do with children. They would never want normal people in the public to know that it's viewed as consumerist, especially for kids. But yeah, when you get behind the scenes, or when these kind of freaky players like Mr. James, they are talking about the consumer issues. And in fact, they deliberately reconceived it back in the 90s as like, this should not be withheld from us the way medicine is withheld. It's, we should move to a more consumer model. And they thought of ways to try to protect doctors from liability.
Right. And this is something that I've heard when I look back at, say, old documentaries from, say, even in the early 70s, there was a documentary where a couple of these men were sat on a panel and they were saying, we just want it, give it to us. Like, why should we have to talk to a doctor? They didn't use the word gatekeeping, but they were the same arguments, that they're making today. But so you were there outside the Supreme Court, and we've just had the ruling come in, and the ruling, was this what you expected?
It was. So I didn't know what to expect. I was very nervous. But in the end, there were a lot of different things that could have happened. And this was kind of the most predictable result, where it's basically a good outcome. It lets Tennessee's ban stand, and probably other states as well. At the same time, it's not perfect. Like, the justices don't understand as much as you and I understand about how this is all just nonsense. They're kind of grasping around and piecing together their path toward the right answer of just allowing this law to stand.
Right, I was kind of surprised that the hearing was 2.5 hours. I'm like, how can you discuss something so big
Yes.
in 2.5 hours?
No, that's right. I mean, I think everyone on our side was almost hoping for it to be an everything hearing and an everything case. The truth is, first of all, it was appealed based on a very early stage motion in a case, so it never went to trial. There was never a moment back in Tennessee where everybody took turns on a witness stand and answered questions. It's mostly done just on paperwork and saying, we'll prove this later. And so there's, it wasn't as thorough as you would hope. And there were a lot of, for example, expert reports submitted by doctors on both sides. And those are good, but I don't know how much time the justices really spent reading them. Like, at least a few of them cited the reports in concurrences, which is great. But, it did seem like the justices were skating along the surface a bit.
It all started in 2023 when Tennessee put a ban in place on basically puberty blockers and hormone treatments for minors, but specifically to treat, gender dysphoria. They made a very clear distinction between the use of these drugs for that purpose and for other purposes, like, for example, precocious puberty. They put that ban in place. Then I think there were 3 minors and their parents and a doctor who went, right, that's not right. This is discrimination on the basis of sex. And I thought that was such an interesting angle to take, right? And then I think there was a district court that said, yeah, you're kind of right. And then Tennessee went, well, hold on, we're going to appeal. Then it went to a circuit court, and the circuit court went, well, no, this is not discrimination on the basis of sex. And then it went to the Supreme Court. Have I got that right?
That's right. Yes. And there's also one other argument, which was kind of parallel. So they said it discriminated by sex, and they also argued it discriminated against transgender people as a class.
Right.
So
That was really interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. Because the first court, the district court, said that this argument stands because trans people are a quasi, it's quite an interesting, see, I'm not a legal person, so the language is quite interesting to me. It's a quasi-suspect group of people.
Yes.
What do they mean by suspect?
Yeah, no, it sounds like they're suspicious characters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or quasi-suspicious, yeah.
But I guess that just means that this is a group of people that is distinct. It can be defined in a clear way.
Yes, defined in a clear way, and also that that we need to watch out that we don't discriminate against them, because historically we have. And so, for example, Black people would be like a regular suspect class, not quasi-suspect. Black or white people, just any racial group. And sex is also a suspicious. You could also call it a suspicious classification. So if the law distinguishes by sex, as the ACLU argued this law did, then that's a quasi-suspicious, is a quasi-suspect class. And so the sex, it already has that status as quasi-suspect. And then the ACLU was arguing that transgender status should also have that same quasi-suspect class status.
Right. Yeah. And the Supreme Court said no.
Well, so it's interesting. Like I said, there's these two arguments that are brought in parallel. So the court decided, the majority said that the law did not classify people by sex, and it did not classify people by transgender status. Therefore, it didn't have to get into the question of whether trans people deserve to be a quasi-suspect class, because this law isn't really about that anyway, according to the majority.
Yeah.
Now, that reasoning is a little sketchy, because honestly, like, of course the law is about trans people. Like, that's what if you think that transgender has any substantive meaning to it at all, which I don't really think it does, but the justices seem to think it does, then, I mean, yeah, of course the law is about that. But it looks like the majority was just trying to make the opinion easier to write and easier to get like a 6-person majority to agree on. So they just acted like it wasn't really about trans people. Now, some of the concurrences written by conservative justices said, oh, come on, guys, let's admit that this is about trans people and just analyze the question. So is this a suspect classification? Transgender status. And so 3 of the justices in their concurrences said, no, they're not. So they basically would have gone further than what the majority did, to just say once and for all that this is not a suspect class. And that would have been helpful in other litigation, for example, related to like bathroom use, would have had these ripple effects outside of this particular area. But right now, only 3 justices are willing to come out and say that. So maybe next year we'll have more justices who are on board. But right now, not a majority. They're just not touching it. They're not saying either way.
Yeah, I think Thomas was one of them. He was pretty clear about it in his concurrence.
It was Thomas, Alito, and Barrett were the 3.
Right. And I guess, like as you said earlier, we've probably been looking into this much longer than they have and into much more detail. It's a lot for them to wrap their heads around. So even so, I thought some of the stuff that especially Thomas came out with was quite hard-hitting and strong. Like, one of the things that's so interesting is the language that is used.
Yes.
So these justices, they use the phrase transgender boy, for example, to refer to a girl who wants to get on testosterone. The language in SB1, so Tennessee's law, is interesting because it talks about asserted identity. And I really quite liked because it's an assertion, obviously, that somebody makes, rather than it being some inherent, innate thing.
Yes, and it avoids the word gender, which we know is so problematic because that word has like 10 different definitions and none of them are ever spelled out in this sort of litigation.
Right, exactly. So then it's at the Supreme Court. Obviously, you're outside, but I'm sure that you watched the hearing later on.
I did. On the train ride back to New York, I was reading the transcripts on the train ride back to New York, and then I think I listened to parts of it later on, so I became familiar with it.
So my understanding was that basically Tennessee claimed this bill is lawful because we're trying to protect the health and welfare of these minors. And the other side argued, no, it's not lawful because it discriminates on the basis of transgender status and on the basis of sex. And I thought, how can you claim that it's on the basis of sex? Under the, what was it? I've got it written
Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, our Constitution.
Yes. I'm not a legal expert, but I thought, you can't claim that it's sex discrimination because they would deny those blockers to both male minors and female minors. So how can you say, how do you feel about how they argue that case?
Well, I mean, they threw everything at the wall. So their arguments were, they focus on the cross-sex hormones because technically girls and boys would be taking different ones. And so they said, well, you're prescribing testosterone, like you're willing to prescribe testosterone to a boy if his puberty hasn't started yet, but you're not willing to prescribe it to a girl if she has gender dysphoria. They wouldn't say girl, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they really emphasize this idea of like kids, like quote unquote cisgender kids are using hormones to look like the sex they want to be, which we're all skeptical. Like, wait, is that really what's going on? Are doctors giving boys testosterone just so they can be manlier? I don't know about that, but it's in the record now. And so that, anyway, in terms of sex discrimination, that's what they were saying, is that they're not giving the drugs to one sex or the other. And then they're also have this very attenuated or shaky argument about stereotypes, where they say the law is trying to prevent people from violating stereotypes. But what they mean by a stereotype isn't, society expects you to be nice if you're a girl. What they mean by a stereotype is society expects you to have breasts if you were assigned female at birth. And that's like a stereotype about people who are assigned female at birth, is that they grow breasts. It's like, that's this biological fact, but they were calling it a stereotype. No, that's what they do, because a certain type of stereotyping is unconstitutional, and so they tried to fit it into that box with their argument. The liberal judges went for it. The conservative justices did not. They talked past each other a little bit, but the bottom line is, legally, it's not a stereotype to say that girls tend to grow breasts when they're going through puberty.
Right, but also this is, and we see this time and time again with all these cases and all these arguments that they use. It's how everything gets sort of twisted inside out and turned upside down, where it's like the ones who are trying to reinforce stereotypes here are the ones who say, I'm a girl, when they're a boy. So it's the boy who says, I'm a girl, and in order to become a girl, I need to have this medical treatment. So, and then the surgeons, obviously, and the endocrinologists get involved to facilitate that. So they are literally trying to mold a male body to fit in with the female mold. So if anyone is using regressive sexist stereotypes, it's them. And then they're arguing that not doing it is reinforcing stereotypes. It's like, what?
And that's what's so frustrating about the way this is played out in America, where the entities that are fighting against the ACLU tend to be conservative. So in this case, there's the state of Tennessee, and they don't see the argument the same way that you and I do, that, the gay people tend to, which is just as you articulated it, which is, hey, these guys are the ones enforcing, like, they're literally imposing stereotypes on people's bodies by like warping their bodies into fit a social stereotype. So that argument is never made in the main briefs. Like, sometimes the feminists make it in amicus briefs, but we don't know if the justices actually read those. And so it's, we don't see that in the arguments before the Supreme Court. We don't see that in the decisions that come out. It's just like this secret argument, but it's totally the best argument. It's the real one. It's what's going on.
Yes. And like, I never came into this from a feminist perspective. I don't think I've ever read I don't think I've ever read like a feminist book as such. I just noticed, when I was growing up as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, simply by not fitting in with these stereotypes of masculinity, you get treated in a certain way, you get made fun of, you get laughed at. So my lesson from that, from my lived experience, has always been embrace your sex and give gender the middle finger. Like, that's how you break stereotypes, not by taking gender and using it as your authentic, the key to your authentic self. That's when you're reinforcing these stereotypes. So for me, that's always been really jarring about this. And then particularly how this affects, those of us who will just grow up to be lesbian, gay, and bisexual, because we're much more likely to not fit in with stereotypes anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the message we were trying to send when we were outside the Supreme Court. And so we had signs that said, stop transing gay kids, and gender medicine is conversion therapy. Yeah. So even though that wasn't made inside the building, we were trying to make that, put that out there outside the building. And we were successful in the sense that there were some media articles that quoted us. And even so, the major liberal outlets will not quote that. They won't talk about that message. So NPR or New York Times, New York Times interviewed a bunch of us that day, but then their story at the end was all about how our side was conservative. And their photos, they had photos that were like cropped and narrow focused on like, a guy who looks stereotypically conservative, because that's the picture that the New York Times wants to show to its readers. But what's interesting is, because there were so many of us, it was hard not to get us in photos. So there are photos that have shown up in the New York Times and in NPR of our signs of members of our groups waving signs about gay kids. and they show up in the photos. They're just not explained in the article.
Yeah. It's like that. There's one battle going on inside the court, and then there's another battle going inside in the media where they keep wanting to control this narrative. Last year, I went to a place in Brighton, which is like super duper like LGBTQIA plus sort of city central in the UK. It's called Brighton. So I went there for Pride with a sign that said puberty blockers are anti-gay, and not knowing how that would be received. And obviously not everybody was happy about it, but I was surprised how many people gave me the thumbs up, even on the parade. Like
in the parade.
And one, like a drag queen came up to me and went, oh, like that. Someone who was driving the truck, someone else. And I thought, we need the visibility. We have to create it somehow. And then there was one guy outside the Supreme Court, a Canadian guy, who copied my sign. And I thought, how amazing is this? You just stand on the street in Brighton, and then the same sign makes its way to the Supreme Court for that very important hearing.
I think that I saw that sign in America too at the Scarametti rally. I think I recall that phrase.
Yeah, because he saw mine and he thought, right, I'm taking that.
Nice.
And I'm showing it here, and I'm like, good for you. Let's get this sign, or whatever sign. Like you guys also have that sign that says "Stop Trans and Gay Kids" or something like that. Again, it's that's how we create the visibility about this. Also, that hearing is online, and now that we've had the ruling, that will help to give it even more visibility, because you can't ignore a Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, you know how polarized we are in America, so there is a fear that it won't change minds. The conservatives will like it, the liberals will not like it. They'll take it as proof that this is just a conservative cause. So we'll see how it plays out. But I think it has at least, it gets in the news and it shakes loose some random facts, right? Like there's an article in the New York Times, which is such a problematic outlet, yesterday, and it had some usual problems, but it did report on these conflicts and tensions within the trans movement and within the ACLU. And so that's helpful, I think, at just kind of causing problems for that side and shaking loose a few negative facts that normal people can read and think like, that's kind of a shady movement. Right.
And one thing that I think was quite an important point that was made by Case Strangio, she was pressed on the fact, something along the lines of, does, all this hormone stuff and hormone blocking stuff, does it reduce suicidality, I think? And she had to admit at the Supreme Court, no, it doesn't.
Yeah, the question was suicide versus suicidality. So they pressed her and she admitted that it's not preventing people from killing themselves.
There is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them.
But then she goes into what suicidality, but trans people say they're going to kill themselves, so that's called suicidality, and that's maybe there's something there.
However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies, that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
And of course, we know that's related to kind of the culture that these kids are encouraged to take part in online, where there's just a lot of talk about suicide. But anyway, it was a great moment when Chase Strangio had to admit it doesn't prevent suicide.
Were there other moments like that you think, wow, that really needed to happen?
There should have been, and this is something that should have gotten more attention, but the Solicitor General of the United States at that point, this was the Biden administration. So the Biden administration was on the side of the ACLU, and they got their own time to argue during this back on December 4th. They were represented by the Solicitor General, who is Elizabeth Prelogar, who is, it's a very esteemed figure. Like, that's one of the top lawyers in America, kind of the top courtroom lawyer in America, and she has this great reputation. And she was up there answering questions about, about these drugs. And by the way, we're talking about hormones and blockers, but not surgery, because even though Tennessee banned those, the ACLU wound up kind of not challenging that part, because they just pretended their clients didn't want surgery anyway, because they didn't want to talk about surgery publicly. So the ban on surgery wasn't before the Supreme Court, but it is in the background there. But in the arguments, they're just talking about hormones and blockers for this reason. And I think it was Justice Thomas, one of the conservatives, was pressing the Solicitor General about the medical effects. And she was really tap dancing to avoid saying there were any. I think at one point, Justice Thomas was asking her about, well, doesn't testosterone cause like different side effects for girls versus boys? And of course it does, because testosterone has very active effect on genitals, and boys and girls have different genitals. And so just there you have like the vaginal atrophy and the enlarged clitoris that the girls are enduring, that of course it's not, it's just for girls. And she was avoiding answering the question. She might have even gone so far as to say no. Oh, I remember what happened. She was really tap dancing and avoiding it, which you're not supposed to do as a lawyer. It's not, you're supposed to be candid and answer the justice questions. And finally, one of the liberal justices swooped in and saved her and just like cut off Justice Thomas and rerouted.
Right.
And this has been pointed out, but only in the conservative media, that the Solicitor General was really kind of crossing lines in terms of arguing too hard and not answering questions about gender medicine. So I think, and that's a really big deal, because this is, like I said, this is like the top public servant lawyer in America. And she was falling short of her ethical duties of candor that day. Because of course you have to, if you're going to really fight hard for this cause.
Right. The ethical duty of candor.
Yeah.
Wow, I like that. Okay, that makes sense. Again, yeah. I'm not a legal expert. I quite like that. And what were some of the arguments made by Tennessee? I mean, they were basically arguing about this is healthcare.
Yeah, Tennessee was saying that we're not discriminating against trans people, we're not discriminating against girls or boys. So this was the argument that the majority eventually adopted, which was that we're discriminating against minors, which we're allowed to do, and not discriminating against, but we're distinguishing between minors and adults. So we're only dealing with minors with this law.
Yeah.
And the law is based on the medical purpose of the drugs, not on the sex of the patient. So it's telling both sexes you can't get gender medicine.
Yeah.
Whatever that
means. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, simple.
Right. It was based on age, as you said, for minors specifically, and it was based on medical use. They made the point, this has nothing to do with identity. It's about the medical use. Did the oral arguments go much into the actual evidence and how contested this area is, especially in recent years?
Some of them did. And so at the oral argument and then in the opinions, you can see that the justices have different focuses. So it is possible to get to a legal ruling without really diving into all the horrors of gender medicine, the medical side effects that are caused by it. And the majority mostly does that because they say Tennessee has such a low bar to clear in defending it that they don't need to show this is like the worst thing ever. They can just show there's kind of questions about its efficacy and maybe people regret it. And like, that's enough. That's rational. But some of the justices who are known as being more conservative, Thomas and Alito, they did probe more into what are the side effects and is WPATH corrupt and, all these different things that we follow in the news. So those two justices, they cite the media reports a lot in their decisions, and they alluded to the cast review a lot. So yeah, they were getting more into the facts we're familiar with than the things that are, maybe not totally legally relevant, maybe not part of a legal argument, but definitely give you background information that makes you look at the case differently.
When the ruling came in, what was your reaction to it?
I felt relieved when I heard about it. I was mostly sure that Tennessee would prevail, but I don't think the justices truly understand it. So for that reason, I was just worried. And even when it came down and I saw the result, I still needed to sit down with it later in the day and read how they wrote the decision, because I'm very concerned with how, as we know, every word matters. And a lot of people don't understand that. They don't realize all the tricks and traps are laid out in the, definitions of gender and sex and all that. So I had to sit down with it later and see, is this safe? And I was thinking, like, how will the ACLU use this in lower courts? Like, how will they take words out of context in order to make their arguments next time? So for me, there couldn't be like a moment of jubilation. I had to sit down and understand the opinion first.
Do you think that some of the arguments could now be used against gay people? I think I haven't read the whole. I've just read bits of it. There was one justice who argued that trans is not a quasi-suspect class because it's too diverse, and he also argued against it being immutable.
Mhm.
Is that something that they could use against gays and lesbians? Because, you know, we have some so-called ex-gays,
Well,
and you
gay
can't
people.
tell from birth if someone's gay or not. Like, that was one of the things he mentioned.
Yeah, well, gay people are not a suspect class or a quasi-suspect class, and they never have been under federal law. Yeah, it's really an interesting history, actually. So we, achieved all these rights without being called a suspect class. Marriage and some other things, mostly marriage. Honestly, when you think about gay rights, a lot of them it's things that actually apply to everybody. Like straight people can marry someone of the same sex if they want. They just don't exercise that right. But anyway, through all that litigation, judges never came out and said, at least at the federal level, they never said that gays were a suspect class. And I think it's for the reasons that you're stating, that it's hard to prove we're immutable. We're not this discrete group. We're everywhere. It's not obvious who is gay. So the judges kind of sidestepped that question. But what they did was they unofficially just gave a little more scrutiny to laws that involve gay people. And so it's known as, that lowest level of scrutiny, which is just the default level that any kind of distinction gets, not a racial group or sex, but just a dentist, for example, would just be given, a law about dentists would be given rational basis scrutiny, which just means the law has to be rational. That's what ended up happening in this Tennessee case. It's very easy for the state to meet. And that's what has always applied to gay people as well. But everybody knows that judges have tended to give a little more scrutiny and be a little tougher on laws that single out gay people. And so it's just this unofficial thing in the law, and it's known as rational basis for the bite.
Yeah.
So that's what it's been in the past, and maybe that will continue. I don't know. I mean, right now, we're not really pursuing any gay rights, right? Like, we have the right to get married. There's some decent anti-discrimination legislation, especially at the state level. So right now, we might be okay in terms of, like I'm not really worried about the fact that if it's harder for us to become a suspect class, I already knew it was going to be really hard if we went for that.
Yeah. And I mean, the arguments that TRAs always make is that, they're coming for the trans rights and the gays will be next.
Yeah.
Even though they're the ones coming for the gays by trying to tell us that males can be female homosexuals and females can be male homosexuals.
I mean, absolutely, they're coming for us. And if there's one reason that in the future the Supreme Court, for example, overturns Obergefell, the gay marriage decision, the reason will be that the whole country got really mad at us for trans reasons because they associated us with trans. It won't be because of any logic embedded in an earlier court decision. It will be because of those politics.
Yes, yeah, which is why it's so important for us to speak out against this. And that's what I was just so relieved in a way to see you guys outside the Supreme Court with those signs, just to represent, the gays, the lesbians, and the bis, and saying we're not down with this shit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I feel. That's why I love seeing you doing what you do, running around outside around Europe with your channel. Yeah, yes, you're very visible, and that you're right. That's exactly what we need. Is this sort of we're saying two things at once. Like, we're saying not only that we're different from the trans, but that we're different from straight people too. Like, you don't pretend to be a straight guy who's like you don't have the same look as Billboard Chris, for example. You're doing your own thing.
No chance.
Yeah.
Even if I try. And this is interesting. Like, I was at a protest in Manchester last Saturday. So there was a protest by mostly angry blokes in dresses against the Supreme Court ruling in the UK, which again was a hugely significant ruling. Probably bigger, I guess, than the one in the States, because this was about how sex is treated in law. Whereas the thing that the US Supreme Court ruling didn't do, it didn't look at what does sex actually mean, because you mentioned Bostock earlier, which was a ruling that basically says that you can't discriminate in employment on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the judge actually said, I took a note of that somewhere, the court declines to address whether Bostock reasoning reaches beyond Title VIII context. They said, we don't want to get into whether, how sex and gender sort of interact in law. They just basically went, okay, let's brush that aside.
Yeah, yeah, it's complicated because they wrote it in a confusing way back in Bostock. So it's confusing as to what they're even not talking about now when they say we're not talking about Bostock.
Right.
But yeah,
right, okay.
So that was sort of a frustration about the majority opinion. Like I said, there are markings on it that suggest it was a political compromise, and the Chief Justice was just trying to hold together as many justices as he could. And part of that was just saying, we won't touch Bostock. Like, it would have been better for America if they had kind of explained what they meant by Bostock and explained whether that reasoning applies outside of Title VII, which is employment law. But they refused to do that, and maybe to keep their coalition together.
Right. And who wrote the majority opinion for this judgment?
That was Chief Justice John Roberts.
Oh, John Roberts. Okay. Because for Bostock, it was Neil. How do you pronounce it?
Yes, Gorsuch. Yeah. And Roberts signed on to that opinion there. So it was an interesting coalition of Gorsuch and Roberts, who were conservatives, with the liberals at the time on the court. So that was Bostock. Yeah. Well, they believed that Bostock was going to be genuinely limited to the employment law context. But of course it wasn't. Of course, I mean, the way the law works in common law countries, at least, is that people are always going to take language from one area of law and kind of carry it to another area of law and say, look, it's the same. Like, this concept is the same, just treat it the same, which is pretty reasonable. Like, I think sex should mean the same thing in different contexts of the law. So I would, support it.
Yeah. But
you can tell how nervous they are on these sex and gender issues. They were like, well, we're going to just keep it really narrow by saying it's really narrow and saying don't use it outside the context. And it doesn't work. Law is contagious.
Yeah. So they haven't dealt with the actual conflict on how you interpret sex and how gender identity and all that stuff muddies the waters and how it creates tension between different groups of people. But even so, we've now had a very clear ruling in the UK. But everybody, lots of people and organizations are trying to deny that it's a clear ruling. They say, actually, no, it's only caused confusion. So that's like, I went to that protest in Manchester and it's so strange to actually be there. Because then again, the difference between, say, you went to the Supreme Court and you were at that rally and you had people trying to drown you out. This time I showed up at a so-called trans protest, not to drown anyone out. In fact, I was there to interview people and to get their point of views. It's the opposite. And they had one guy speaking, he was a gay man, and he just says, we reject the Supreme Court ruling. And I'm like, how can you stand there as a gay man saying you reject the very ruling that protects your rights?
Yeah.
As a gay man, because that was a key thing of the Supreme Court ruling in the UK. But anyway, that aside, I spoke to one man and he wasn't there, in support of the trans side. He was just there to see what was going on. So I'm interviewing him. We're having a little chat. And he goes, yeah, I'm against all this trans stuff. And then he goes, yeah, but I'm also against the gay stuff. No one's born gay. And I'm like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Because they think it's all the same. What has the reaction been in the States to this judgment?
So the reaction, the New York Times, and I have to be honest, this came down like middle of the day, less than 2 days ago. So like I was at work and then I went home and read it. And then I've been like writing about it and reading about it. So I've not been out on the street talking to like regular folks. But I know in the media, total explosion, there seems to have been a lot of stories that were already pre-written because people pretty much expected that Tennessee would prevail. So there are about 18,000 stories on the New York Times about this tragedy. And of course, and then among the gender critical people, I mean, people were happy. I think those of us who are lawyers were reading it a little bit with a little more cynicism and thinking, of the decision's shortcomings. But I think in the movement more broadly, people are very relieved and happy and seeing it as a victory that we can build on.
Yeah, because it's clear now that the Tennessee ban will stay in place.
Technically, this is such an annoying thing to say, but there's not as much finality as you would hope in this judgment. It definitely puts the writing on the wall that the Supreme Court is fine with these bans and doesn't want to strike them down. But there are other constitutional arguments that have been made, even in Tennessee. So, for example, that parental rights. That's like if a parent wants a doctor to give the kids the treatments and the parents' rights are being abridged by the law. This doesn't make sense because in America, we don't have a right to health care. So why would you suddenly have no right? The kid doesn't have any right to health care, but the parent has a right to get their kid the health care. Just to go out and say that the kids' rights are not protected as this decision did. But then to say their parents have a separate right to give them a drug that they don't have a right to receive, it doesn't. Yeah. I don't think the parental right argument adds up. But it is still out there, and it technically hasn't been defeated. It's and this is in multiple states. So the Supreme Court actually declined to review that argument when they took up the one that we're talking about. So the most recent ruling in that case is the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals declining to block the law temporarily, but the ACLU could still go forward and say, like, we want a trial on this, basically. Like, we want to have a trial on this parental rights issue. And so I believe that's still alive, and that could happen. They have that in other states as well. Some of the challenges that the ACLU and other groups have brought against these types of laws are under state constitutions rather than the federal constitution. So Montana is a big example. Just recently, just recently, the trans side won a trial in Montana, and they were arguing that the law violates the state constitution, which has is more broad than the federal constitution in certain ways, apparently. And so that is on appeal now to the Montana Supreme Court, which in the past has been favorable toward the trans side. Even though we think of Montana as a pretty Republican state, it might wind up being the state that creates like a right to pediatric gender medicine that doesn't exist anywhere else. So it'll be this funny irony if it shakes out that way. And it's another example of how this litigation is not dead yet. And there was a little loophole in the decision 2 days ago where the court said, well, of course, it would be a different story if the state law had been passed out of animus toward transgender people, like trying to, like this phrase was invidious discrimination, if we're trying to. Yes. So it said, but that wasn't the case here. The ACLU did not argue it. Now, first of all, I don't think that's true. I went back and looked at the ACLU's briefs, and I think the argument is in there. It's not, it's kind of made very briefly, but it's in there. So I think the court fudged that because they just didn't want to deal with the question of invidious discrimination. But in other states, that argument is being made more bluntly and obviously, because in some states, when the legislatures were debating these laws, they had some lawmakers who were saying kind of dramatic things based on the Bible that were implying there was some connection to Satan, perhaps. And so that you can construe as invidious discrimination.
We now call our next witness Satan.
Yeah, they're going to call Satan to the stand, and he's going to say, yeah, definitely discriminate against trans people. So I don't know. I mean, that's just one of those things with the Supreme Court ruling is you can analyze them all you want, but at the end of the day, you need to see what plays out in the real world. Like, will the ACLU pursue that argument? Will the courts say, I mean, a lot of their lawsuits are already well underway, so maybe it's like somehow too late for them to bring the argument. But I think in at least one of the states, they could still make the argument, and we'll see what happens. I mean, there's a lot of ways it could play out. And the ACLU itself is going out and saying there are still avenues for litigation. We're still going to fight this.
Of course. Well, there are some, organizations that are very invested in pushing the trans kid stuff in particular. So they're not just going to roll over and go, oh, well, never mind, we'll do something else. We'll find another cause, if you like. And there's a more sinister side to it in terms of the pharmaceutical interest in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like there's no rest for the wicked, right? You think you've got a legal victory, and then there's all this other stuff going on. Also, Trump had his executive order that was called Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. Now, this has been blocked in a number of states. Will this Supreme Court ruling have any effect on those blocks? Will those blocks now be lifted, or is there a whole other legal ballgame?
Yeah, there's some overlap in the law, but I think the blocks have to do with kind of whether that order did a lot of things. It wasn't just one thing. And it kind of directed agencies to do various things. And then I think some of the agencies even went beyond it, arguably. So in some ways, when the agencies were blocking funding that had already been paid out, I think that is its own legal issue, which has to do with like procedure and technicalities. It is helpful that the Supreme Court said that there's not a fundamental right under the Constitution to receive these drugs. I think that is useful for some of the arguments here.
Has Trump even responded to it himself?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't seen a response by Trump.
I'll have a look. Yeah. And we know that WPATH and the AAP, they've all come out denouncing it.
Yeah, there was a barrage of press releases from the usual suspects. They are all doubling down and just kind of spewing out the same nonsense about life-saving care, even though their side has admitted that it doesn't prevent suicide.
Right. And I guess it wasn't a surprise that the 3 liberal justices sided with the trans side, but they also really were gung-ho about it, weren't they?
They were, yes. And we saw that at an oral argument where they sounded actually angry. And now the 3 of them have filed their dissent. It was authored by Justice Sotomayor, and she wrote it. And by the way, she's the senior member of that wing. So that means she got to decide who wrote the opinion, and she chose herself. So she really wanted it. It may be that all 3 of them wanted it because they were so excited about this subject. So Sotomayor's dissent is emotional. She actually says at one point, like, in sadness, I dissent. It's a little unconventional to, but I think she read it from the bench also, which is a dramatic move. So she's trying to signal in every way that she supports the trans kids. She believes in the concept. What's interesting is that one of the liberals did peel off from the other 2 in a small way. So remember, they're kind of different steps to the analysis. First, they have to decide whether the law makes a distinction by transgender status or by sex. And then after that, they have to apply the tests as to whether the law, whether the state is able to defend it or not. And so Sotomayor applied every possible step. And she went all the way to the end of the analysis, and she said, this law is unconstitutional. It doesn't pass the test. It does distinguish by transgender status and by sex. So kind of she went down the line and checked every box. But Justice Kagan wrote separately to say she agreed on the first few steps of the analysis, but she did not agree that the law must be unconstitutional. She said, well, we need more facts to determine that. So she says, I do think that it's subject to heightened scrutiny because it distinguishes by sex and by transgender status. But I don't know if the state can meet its burden of defending the law. Maybe it can. I need to know more. So that shows that she has at least one foot planted in the real world, where she sees some of this evidence about detransitioners maybe and about medical side effects. And she's like, okay, well, maybe the state had an okay reason for passing this law. I'm not sure. I don't want to say at this point. So that's interesting that she's not completely off on another planet.
Now, earlier you mentioned that ban in Montana that's being overturned. Is there then a way for the legislature in Montana to draft a bill slightly differently so it wouldn't be unconstitutional?
Well, I mean, just changing the wording a little bit, probably not, because that ruling was pretty sweeping. Like they got at the underlying concept. What Montana would have to do is actually amend their state constitution, because that's the only way they could trump, the court ruling. And so that would involve, I think they'd probably, the states all have different rules for how to amend their constitution, but usually it takes a couple of years at least. They need to get voters to approve it, maybe like a higher supermajority of the legislature. So it would be a big deal to amend their constitution. Right.
I think the state of Iowa, they just took gender identity out of the discrimination law, just like within days.
Yeah, so that was just a statute. It wasn't in their constitution. So they were able to do it probably a simple majority of legislators. Yeah.
Right. Okay. God, it's complicated.
It really is.
It's like, from this conversation, I'm getting it's not necessarily as big a victory as I thought it was.
I mean, it is. I'm giving you all these caveats because I'm a lawyer and I have to be picky, but it's basically good. And I think it will set in motion certain things. Like, remember I was talking about the press that came out, like the story that came out that makes the ACLU look bad, makes Chase Strangio, the lead attorney, look bad. It's an example of the fallout of having a big loss. So you probably are seeing, some donors might want to double down, but a lot of donors might think, I think we're on a death march here. I think we're eventually going to lose. I don't want to put my money into this anymore.
Yeah, we've seen that in the UK. Lots of prides being cancelled because the corporates aren't sponsoring. Do you think this ruling, or even taking the case to the Supreme Court, do you think that the trans side have kind of shot themselves in the foot now?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about their strategy and whether they messed up. And it's really hard to say, because that kind of almost assumes that there was a better path available to them where they would have been more successful. And maybe there was a path available where they could have forestalled an embarrassing loss by a few months or a year or so. But fundamentally, they are arguing something that's false. And courts are going to figure that out eventually. So it's just a matter of, they're going to have more losses soon. For example, all this stuff related to girls' sports in Title IX. Like they're going to lose on that eventually. They're losing in public opinion.
There was another ruling about Title IX that it definitely refers to sex and not to gender identity. Was that earlier this year?
There have been so many rulings. Essentially, we all know the Supreme Court is eventually going to say that Title IX is about sex. I mean, well, Title IX has the word sex, right? And the Supreme Court, as sketchy as it's been on the subject, it has said that sex relates to physical attributes, meaning not gender identity. So there's just no basis for, and the way they like to read statutes does not include just like importing in random concepts like gender identity. Like we know what's going to happen eventually, but because we have some liberal, I hate to say it because I am liberal, but the truth is, you know, we have these judges who are appointed by Democrats, especially in regions like the West Coast and New England, where they are just going to make these rulings that are ridiculous on their face, that they know the Supreme Court's going to overturn eventually. And because they're willing to do that, it keeps the hope alive of, you know, the ACLU's donors, and it makes the ACLU's position look plausible for a while longer, even though it's really just wasting everybody's time.
And harming children in the process.
Yes.
What does the ruling mean to you on a personal level?
Oh, on a personal level. Yeah, I guess this is kind of a personal case because this for me was going to that rally was my first public event as somebody who I've been writing for a while, but I started using my real name in October. That's when I attached my real name to my blog and my X. And so, and part of the reason was actually, I knew this argument was coming up and I said, I don't want to be holding back my advocacy. I just want to go out there and any way that I can, you know, not just making arguments on a blog, but also showing up places in person, doing podcasts. I just decided like, this is a good, like, I want to be a part of this. I don't want to sit it out. So I need to use my real name. So for me, I do think of it as sort of a turning point in my advocacy. And it's nice to see it kind of come to fruition, or like that cycle is over. Like Scrimeti is done now. It's in the books.
Yeah, it can't be challenged.
Yeah.
Right, you can't go any higher.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm glad you made that decision to show your face. You know, it's a risky decision to take. But the more of us are visible and having conversations like this, that others can work. Just like I think as gays and lesbians, we give so much permission to straight people who want to talk about this but are scared to be considered anti-LGBT, anti-gay, and all this kind of stuff just by talking common sense. But we can create that space for them. And again, that visibility that you gave and the others outside the Supreme Court, you know, they can try and crop pictures, but they can't stop us from sharing stuff on Twitter or other places where we can now get the word out ourselves. Have you had any pushback or any sort of, you know, horrible stuff come your way because you put your face and your name out there?
I wouldn't classify it as horrible. Yeah, there's been some pushback. There's some people who are mad at me. At that point, I had already been discussing this openly in my life, including with people who disagreed with me. So, you know, I already had, I'll just be very vague, people in my circles who were mad and maybe not talking to me. And so that was fine. It has been brought to the attention of my employer, which is definitely a result. I think this is a result of my name being out there. Just a guess about how that played out. And right now, it's fine. I work in government, which means in America that my employer can't retaliate against me for exercising my free speech rights outside of work. Mm-hmm. So I'm very lucky in that regard compared to, for example, somebody who works for a private corporation and that is not tolerant of their views. So I'm just going forward, and it's mostly been positive using my name. Like, I'm happy for so many reasons. I've been able to engage more. I've been able to go to other events as well on top of Scrimeti. I went to Boston Pride a few weeks ago and ending up on Twitter, and we did get some of those discreet thumbs up that you talked about, or like, you know, nods. And so I love being a part of that. And so far it's been a very good thing that I've used my name. What signs did you hold up in Boston? Is that where I saw you in a clip talking to that guy with the long curly hair? Yeah, right. Yeah, the curly hair guy. And there's also one of me kind of getting chased around by a TRA, a guy, guy with an umbrella. Oh yeah, I'll send you that. It is the silliest thing ever. So we were holding Most of us had those same signs you saw in Scarametti, stop trans and gay kids. They're very bright. They're pink and purple with yellow letters. And so we were yelling that. Some TRAs came, just like some very young people, maybe trans identified themselves, at least one of these guys was, and they were trying to block us. So it was kind of like, we're in Boston Commons, it's a messy scene, and we're on a hill, and they stand up in front of us to block us. And then one guy, and I just kept yelling and jumping around, so there's one guy who was maybe trying to be female, I don't know, like, he walked up and he had an umbrella, and he opened it in my face, and was just spinning it so that I couldn't get my...
Right.
So I started running around to get away from his umbrella, and then that became like this whole ridiculous spectacle. And I was just screaming, "Why is this guy blocking my side?" And he was chasing me, and I was like, it was very goofy. Gender nonconformity is natural, and those things should not be given drugs.
Yeah, gender nonconformity is natural,
Totally
and some of that means that some people are trans.
Very dangerous drug, and they use to castrate sex offenders. Look at my side. This person doesn't want you to look at my side. Why does this person not want you to see my side? Because they're transing gay kids. They're injecting teenage lesbians with anabolic steroids. Why doesn't this person want you to see my side? It's because it's true. Gender doctors at Boston Children's Hospital are hurting gay kids. Gender nonconformity is natural, and it should not be treated with cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers. These are extremely dangerous drugs. And it was, you know, it's really cathartic to do that at Pride, actually, because I've just felt for so long that it's all about talking. It's all about breaking the taboo against talking. Like, the reason why the other side is so aggressive in policing their taboo and in coming after our jobs and calling us names is because they know that once we can just talk, once people hear us, they're dead. So, like, all they have is taboo, and we need to puncture it. And sure, you know, at first when I was doing this, I imagined puncturing it by writing an article that everybody reads, you know, trying to get printed in some left-wing media outlet. And I've totally abandoned that. I don't like, the New York Times is clearly a hostile entity that is pushing an agenda. And we need to get our message out by literally yelling it at people. Like, I'm so sorry, that's not civilized. I actually wound up having a great conversation with a woman who was like a mother of a child who identified as trans, for a young child. I had this conversation in Boston, and the conversation started with her being like, "Why are you doing this? It's so disruptive. Like you shouldn't be so aggressive. It's upsetting to people." And I was saying, no, we have to be aggressive. And it's true, because if we're just too well behaved and we're waiting to be published in the civilized outlets, it's not going to happen.
Well, I mean, we know this from the last 15 years that when you play along with Be Kind, you just get taken for a ride. At the same time, you know, we don't want to look like the other side. But then again, there's whenever I've listened, particularly to women doing speeches at these events, and when they get angry during the speeches, it's a different kind of anger. It's a, you know, with the other side, it's just mad. It's unhinged. It's just crazy. And again, that last protest I was in Manchester, there was a guy there who is a bit like Billboard Chris. He's like a British version. And he's got this sandwich board with the trans colors on it. And on one side it says, "There's no such thing as a transgender child." Now he just stands there, right? He's not aggressive. He just stands there. But obviously people are get angry just by his presence. So in Manchester, they started to stand around him again to block him from view, because nobody was allowed to see his sign. And they had these big flags. So again, they tried to block him. And then he managed to sort of break free. And then they went on a march. They did some talks, but then there was an altercation between two lesbians, like, because they were being aggressive to those two lesbians who were there to film. And they didn't have any signs. They were just there filming. They then got pushed around and shoved around. And it got quite heated. And then they basically stopped the speeches. We'd only had like two speakers, like from the other side. And then they decided to go on a march. And this guy with the sandwich board, Steve, he actually ended up at the very front of the march. So it's like the guy with the sign saying "There's no such thing as a transgender child" ended up being at the very front of the march, which, you know, again, it's that's what we need, that kind of stuff. Oh God. So yeah, here's the puncturing.
Yeah, because it's not just, I mean, we get so caught up in arguing and what's the best argument to make, and all that is important too. But it's so powerful to just stand there making a true statement, like sex is not assigned at birth. Because our argument is not actually that complicated. It's stuff that people already know, but they're afraid to say it. So if we can just go out there and hold our sign or just shout it and be heard, then we don't have to worry so much about like these endless articles about studies or whatever.
Yes, and sex is a spectrum because blah, 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 blah. You had that that exchange with the guy with the really long curly hair.
Yeah.
He was quite nice compared to most that I've encountered. He was patient.
Oh, yeah.
I thought as soon as he started talking, I thought he's probably on the autistic spectrum. And then he said that he was. It's just the way that he interacted. He was quite sweet in a way because he asked the questions.
Yeah, I definitely had no complaints about, I mean, almost any of our interactions were fine. You know, nothing was violent. I don't think anybody should be trying to drown anyone else out, which is what they were trying to do with the umbrella. Mm-hmm. But in the end, it worked out well for us. So yeah, the guy who's very young, we're talking about somebody who had transitioned medically as a teenager, maybe as a young teenager. And so he did look very feminine. I mean, that's kind of conversation, like I'm definitely happy to have it with anybody who wants to talk. Like when you're out there, that's what you have to do. And people have different approaches to that kind of conversation. Like some are more confrontational. You would hear I'm on a video with some, like the person behind the camera is kind of needling him a bit.
Yes. No, it was interesting to see the two different approaches that you both had. And I can see where both of these coming from because it depends on the moment. It depends on who you're talking to. But I really like that exchange between you two and how, you know, he had the space to say his piece. What worries me is he believes it.
Yeah.
Right? He believes he's a woman. And we have a whole generation now of these kids who are just so like, how are they ever going to adjust, I guess, back to reality?
Yeah. Well, actually, so what I can say about that situation is after our conversation, I left and he wound up connecting with a member of our group, Simon, who is a de-sister. So he's a young man who thought he was female, you know, as a teenager, wanted to transition and ended up not doing so. And so those two had a conversation that was very long. And so I take it that it was, you know, a good connection. And I don't know. I mean, I found the conversation so uncomfortable because this guy was young. I think he said he was 19 and he looked younger. I don't want to be telling somebody that they like, you know, judging their life or I mean, what I really want to do is stop that guy from hurting himself and especially from getting surgery if he hasn't done that already. But like, I don't know how to convince somebody not to get a surgery. And if I knew, I would try it, even if it were inappropriate. But I just don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a diplomat. And, you know, so then just like having this whole, we wind up going around and around about like mental health studies or whatever, which like, who even cares? All those like garbage, junk science that we know. Ugh. Yeah, that's not my favorite mode of activism. Is like those man on the street conversations. I'm not unwilling to have them because I think you have to have them if you're going out there holding a sign.
Yeah.
But like I kind of like running around. And I like the silly stuff a lot more personally.
Yeah, there was one recently. I don't know quite where in the States, but it's a gay guy who's a detransitioner. He was out on the street. And he had quite a few of these men, but like the aggressive type, kind of run up to him. So he's filming them with his body cam, I think, or his phone. And so it's just the detransition guy going, AGPs, you're all a bunch of AGPs. And then the AGP is going, raw, raw. Oh my God. So,
Trans-identified males are autogynephiles.
Okay, whatever. No one cares.
You're a transvestite.
Go back. Yes, I am, you fucking stupid bitch.
Yes, you are AGP.
Get the fuck out of our city.
Yes, you are AGP. Trans-identified males are autogynephiles. Trans-identified males are autogynephiles. No child is trans.
Bitch, suck my dick.
They were sort of the growling, aggressive ones. It's almost like a scene. Like I just saw that new movie 28 years later in the cinema yesterday, and it kind of reminded me of one of those scenes. And he was just like, that was very. I mean, I'm glad no. Well, I think actually they did push him up against the wall or something, because you know it can get quite hairy. So you have to be careful.
Well, yeah, that was something I was conscious of. They're those scary looking AGP guys at Pride. And even though I was yelling at a lot of people, like if I saw like a gay couple, I would just yell at them like funny stuff and they might giggle. But like with the AGP guys who were just like big and brawny and walking around in bikinis, I was looking away. I was like just sending every signal that I was surrendering, you know? Because yeah, those guys are scary. And
Yes.
yeah.
There was one in London after the Supreme Court ruling here. Thousands of people took to the streets, outside Parliament to protest. And one of them was this guy who must have been in his late 60s, early 70s. And it was quite a beautiful summer's day. He wore, I don't know, some denim skirt or some denim shorts or something. And then this, just like a bra.
Yeah.
Sort of like a bra type thing, a pink bra. And he's standing there with his big man face and his big man hands and his, trying to show off his moves. And then he was being interviewed. So he said, "We like women so much, we want to be them."
Yeah.
We love women so much, we want to be one.
Which to me, it's so creepy. But as he said that, he grabbed his chest and he did that. It's
He
like
likes women.
But it's like they can't help themselves, right? And
Yeah.
they reveal themselves in those moments. It's like Operation Let Them Speak. It's right.
This is the same confusion they have at the Supreme Court, is confusing women with women's body parts. When he's
Right.
like, I like women's body parts, is what he was saying. Yeah.
Anyways, and the way that he touched them, it's
Yeah.
like, you're getting off of this. You're getting off of
Yeah.
this. You can't even hide it. What do you think is the next big sort of legal thing to look out for in the States?
Well, within just the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a ruling in a case called Mahmoud v. Taylor, and that is about the parental right to opt your children out of lessons related to, quote, LGBTQ themes. So we had a school in Maryland that was teaching these lessons about gender identity and even sexuality to kids as young as like 4. And some parents wanted to opt their kids out, and they said the reason was their religion, which, of course, is very protected in the United States. And the school said no. Normally schools say yes. The school said no. So this fight wound up going all the way to Supreme Court. And so we're waiting on that ruling. Should see it this month.
Where can people find you?
I am on Substack. My newsletter is called Bad Facts. And I'm on X. My real name, Glenna Goldis. Oh, I just want to say I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'm glad that our society is talking about this because of the ruling. I think that's basically a positive thing. And I'm glad to talk to you, Mr. Menno. And thank you for all of your hard work on the streets of the UK.
Yes. Well, it's like once you know, you can't not know, right? Yeah. Once you
Exactly.
decide to get in there and do something, then you're in. Anyways, thank you so much for your time and sharing your insights with us. And I look forward to seeing more of your work on Substack and to see more of you out in the wild challenging this stuff.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Thanks for watching, everyone. Ciao.
Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my PayPal and Patreon supporters. Because of you, I can make videos like this. Special shout out to my big spenders. Helper Open, Mama Turv and the Turventines, me Julie, the lovely Mary, Julia, Dusty, Judels, Leffy, Dorothy, Wildfire, Esther, and Martha. Thank you.